Saint Augustine, the famous Saint Augustine, he said, "Give me chastity and continence, O Lord, but not yet." Give me chastity and continence, but not yet. So, the theme of the class today, as Prabhupada and the verse itself clearly shows, is that, sense gratification, enjoying our senses, leads to unhappiness. And so we have to be convinced somehow or other. We have to come to the conviction. We have to cultivate the conviction that sense gratification does not lead to satisfaction, but on the contrary, leads to dissatisfaction. So that's the theme of the class. I remember before I became a devotee, I used to do some karaoke sometimes, and actually one of my favorite songs is when I was a high school student and stuff, was a throwback to when I was younger. It's funny, today you hear teenagers listening to 1980s music, and dressing like Jane Fonda from Let's Get Physical. I saw that at the Florida State campus the other day, and they're listening to. So there's always a 20-15 year gap. So anyway, when I was in high school, one of my favorite songs was "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" by the Rolling Stones. Mick Jagger and so on. If you have never heard of the Rolling Stones, then that shows that I'm really old, and material nature really is a world of names, as the Bhagavatam calls it. So I used to sing that song on my own, and I remember doing karaoke's where I just kind of go crazy and sing, I can't get no satisfaction, but I try, I can't get no. And what's funny is that I never came to the conclusion. Well, I kind of did, I guess, by coming to Krishna. That, okay, well, if I can't get any satisfaction, then where is the satisfaction, and why continue trying, So that's a personal anecdote I want to share with you. Another one that's related to this verse and to this theme is a story that happened when I was, just a short anecdote. I was on Indradumna Swami's Polish tour. I spent 5, 6, 7 years, summers over there with him. And I always remember one time, me and his personal servant at the time, or assistant, we walked into his room in one of these, old ex-communist Polish classrooms, because that's what we do. We camp out. We basically take 300 or 350 devotees take over one of these old communist architecture schools, preschools, basically middle school, and take over all the rooms. And so one of the rooms was his room. So we walked in. I always remember this. He said to us, he said, he used the word preaching, which is not that taboo of a word. And he said, preaching really saves us. It saves us. That's the point he was making, that, outreach, giving Krishna to others, sharing the holy name with others saves us. So, all of us, we're basically, all of us who are in this Krishna conscious practice, we're all basically, struggling with this tug of war with our senses, right? We're teetering between, restraint and, libido, and on a deeper level, we're struggling with the issue of faith, how much do we have faith in this proposition, which Krishna himself actually makes in the Bhagavad Gita, that, that sense gratification leads to unhappiness. So I think we can all identify, with this question. So let me read the verse and the purport. The verse is Evam Grihesh. We're reading 9th canto, chapter 6, verse 48. Evam Grishvev Abhirato Vishayan Vividhai Sukai Seva Mano Nachatu Shyad Ajas Stokair Ivana Laha, which Prabhupada translates as follows. This is the story of Saubhari Muni. In this way, Saubhari Muni enjoyed sense gratification in the material world, but he was not at all satisfied. Just as a fire never ceases blazing if constantly supplied with drops of fat. So remember the context, he was just, underwater, minding his own business, meditating, and then he just sees 2 fish having sex. And he's like, and then he's a Muni, so he's kind of like what we would say a sannyasi, and I'll touch on that. For a young bachelor or a young lady to get married is actually a step up, or at least there's absolutely nothing sort of wrong or any type of step down in doing so. But for a sannyasi, or let's say a muni, who perhaps may not have taken a formal institutional vow of renunciation, but who has, for all what's the word, just basically has taken to the renounced order, for him or to come back to family life is not really the greatest thing to do, right? So we have to remember that, because back in the, as a small parentheses, back in the 70s, 80s, there was this, and we're still, I think, ISKCON wise or Vaishnav wise, we're still kind of suffering from this idea. I mean, well, not so much now, especially not with a forward-thinking community like the Bhakti Center. But for example, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. This is just to close the parentheses. I remember when I was a monk, a brahmachari, living in the ISKCON Los Angeles temple, and we'd go out to the LAX airport every day to distribute Prabhupada's books. One of our heroes was Harinamananda from Switzerland, a disciple of Harikesh Swami. This was like 1980s. Harikesh Swami was like the emperor of, actually Prabhupada called him like the emperor of book distribution or something. He had two disciples from Switzerland who were just the heroes of all the brahmacharis in the world who distributed Prabhupada's books, because they were able to distribute just phenomenal amounts of books, and they were brahmacharis. And so one day we heard that Harinamananda was getting married. And I remember we came back at the ashram and we're like, oh my God, and we were like 20 years old, and at the time there was a visiting sannyasi called Rasananda Swami from Brazil, a disciple of Hridayananda Maharaj, who was there. And so we came in this room and he was like, Maharaj, like we heard Harinamananda got married, and he's like, so that's nothing wrong with that. That's a step up on the Varnashram ladder. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I remember that, that stuck with me for all these years. So back to Saubhari Muni. I'll read the verse again. Saubhari Muni enjoyed sense gratification because he got married with 50 wives after seeing those two fish having sex, right? But here the verse says that he was not satisfied. He enjoyed sense gratification with 50 wives. So that's a lot of sex, right? But he was not at all satisfied, just as a fire never ceases blazing if constantly supplied with drops of fat. So here's Prabhupada's purport. Prabhupada says, material desire is just like a blazing fire. If a fire is continually supplied with drops of fat, the fire will increase more and more and never be extinguished. Therefore, the policy of trying to satisfy material desires by catering to one's material demands will never be successful. In modern civilization, everyone is engaged in economic development, which is another way of constantly dropping fat into the material fire. The Western countries have reached the summit of material civilization, but people are still dissatisfied. Real satisfaction is Krishna consciousness. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 5.29, where Krishna says, Bhoktaram Yagyak Tapasam. By the way, 5.29 is what Prabhupada called the peace formula, which is a verse that Prabhupada had printed on a pamphlet called the Peace Formula, which devotees passed out at Vietnam War rallies. And he called it the Peace Formula. Bhoktaram yagyatapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suridam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shanti mrichati. Quote, the sages who know me as the ultimate purpose of all sacrifices and austerities, the supreme lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities, attains peace from the pangs of material miseries. Unquote. One must therefore take to Krishna consciousness and advance in Krishna consciousness by properly following the regulative principles. Then one can attain an eternal, blissful life in peace and, knowledge. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So remember I mentioned that Krishna talks about this principle in the Bhagavad Gita. Well, in 522 and in 1838, Krishna addresses this point of sense enjoyment and how it just doesn't leave us happy. So I'll read those verses to you. In 522, Krishna says, Yehi sansparsha jhaboga dhuka yonaya evate adyantavanta kaunteya nate shuramate buddha. An intelligent person does not take part in the source of misery, in the sources of misery, which are due to contact with the material senses. O son of Kunti, such pleasures have a beginning and an end, and so the wise man does not delight in them. Right? So one thing that's established as a premise is that the contact of our senses with sense objects, by definition, is a source of misery. And why? Well, Krishna explains. He gives the reason. He says, because such pleasures have a beginning and an end. Because they're temporary. Just by the very nature of sense gratification being temporary, a wise person, a wise soul, restrains from engaging in sense gratification because of that temporary nature of that pleasure. So that's assuming something else. That's assuming that there is such a thing as eternal pleasure, as unending pleasure, right? That's the sort of the silent assumption of this verse, because logically speaking, if there's no such thing as an eternal pleasure, as an eternal happiness, as unending happiness, then, all we got is temporary pleasure, and hey, might as well, cash in on whatever we got, because there's nothing else out there, right? Now, the other verse that talks about this is in relationship to the three modes of nature, and it's also very relevant. Listen to this one. This is in the 18th chapter, verse 38. Krishna says, that happiness which is derived from contact of the senses with their objects, same thing, and which appears like nectar at first but poison in the end, is said to be of the nature of passion. So here Krishna himself, God himself, says, hey, you want, happiness in the mode of passion is defined in this way. It starts out, as happiness and ecstasy, and it turns into fear, it turns into anxiety, and turns into suffering. And that's just the very nature of happiness in the mode of passion, right? And most souls in this world, including most of us, but at least we're trying to reach some transcendence in terms of happiness, are in that mode of trying to, get our senses to come in contact with the objects of the senses, right? Prabhupada makes a really, I find a very sort of direct and graphic analogy in the purport. Listen to this. A young man and a young woman meet. And again, this is not, preaching celibacy. This is not preaching like you got to not get married. You got to move into a brahmachari ashram or into a convent. This is a principle that applies to everyone, whether you're a monk living in an ashram or whether you're a housewife or a house husband, or it applies to everyone, okay? But here Prabhupada gives a very graphic example. A young man and a young woman meet, and the senses drive the young man to see her, to touch her, and to have sexual intercourse. In the beginning, this may be very pleasing to the senses, but at the end, or after some time, it becomes just like poison. They are separated, or there is divorce, there is lamentation, there is sorrow, etc., etc. Such happiness is always in the mode of passion. Happiness derived from a combination of the senses and the sense objects is always a cause of distress and should be avoided by all means. So yeah, there's just different categories of happiness out there, right? And happiness in the mode of goodness is basically happiness from the beginning to end, right? And happiness in the mode of passion, as Krishna described here, is sweet at the beginning but poison at the end, right? So we should remind ourselves of that. I was listening to those Prabhupada Memories videos recently, and the first video ever published has Atmaram Prabhu speak about his memories, and he remembered how Prabhupada told him directly at his initiation day. He was like sitting in front of Prabhupada, right, getting his beads. And Prabhupada said, material life is just like an infection. You scratch and you feel some pleasure. You scratch some more and you feel some pleasure. And then you scratch some more and you stop. Not because you are satisfied, but because blood comes. I can't get no satisfaction. I mean, just by nature, a soul in a material body cannot get satisfaction by gratifying the body to the utmost limit. It just, at the end, you just get blood. You don't get that satisfaction. On the contrary, you make the situation worse, We were just celebrating Nishingadev's appearance day, and in the 4th or 5th chapter of the Bhagavatam, Hiranyakashipu is described as someone who, had dominion over the entire universe. Was just like, he had everything under his command, and yet the narrator says that Hiranyakashipu was not satisfied. And why? Because he was not able to control his senses. You see, so most souls are hankering to get something that they don't have, right? But some souls who, whatever, due to some demoniac austerities or due to some pious activities, may have, quote unquote, everything they have. Although if they're not Krishna conscious, they're always hankering for more. But just let's assume that someone has everything they want. Example like George Harrison or the Beatles. George Harrison mentioned in some of interviews that, they had everything because George Harrison, the Beatles, may be an example that we can sort of relate to a little bit more because it's, recent in history and because, Hiranyakashipu and dominion over an entire planet, what to speak of an entire universe, it's just hard for us to conceive. But the principle is there. You have everything and still you're just not satisfied. That's why the Bhagavatam describes that, Yudhishthira Maharaj, one of the 5 Pandavas, right, who also, in a righteous way, had dominion over the whole planet. He was the emperor of the whole planet. He the only thing that satisfied him was service to Krishna. The only thing that and he was convinced of that. And the only thing that really gave him that satisfaction was bhakti to Krishna, right? Because our scriptures say that's the natural constitution of the real self. That's the real constitution of you, of me, that we are souls, that each soul, first of all, the soul is not the body. So all these identifications, by the way, as a small parenthesis, this is kind of an interesting realization, I think. More and more we're hearing this rhetoric in terms of gender issues, identifying as. I identify as, straight or fluid or hetero or bi or homo or whatever, all these, But what's really interesting is this notion of I identify with. And so the sort of the positive thing about this, and the negative thing is that, people are just getting more and more and more absorbed in illusion, identifying all the more with something that they're not. Right? Because, according to the Gita, 101, we're not our bodies, right? So you're not gender fluid or gender, heterosexual or homo or lesbian, or you're just not that. You're not your body, period, right? But the positive thing about this, you can look at it this way, is that this very word, this very rhetoric of I identify as implies that I'm different from that. So in that very rhetoric, there's sort of what's implied is that I'm just identifying with my body, but I'm not my body, right? And then that's really, really cool because that's what we believe, right? I identify with this body. So, taking it a little bit further, I identify as, whatever, all these, different gender classifications, but the very saying of I identify as shows that there's some improvement in the sort of the general consciousness of people in modern society, because before you never heard hey, I identify as, you know what I mean? You just heard I am, I am gay or I am straight. Now it's identify as, and so that implies, as I said, a certain amount of detachment from the thing that you're identifying with, and then that's a nice thing moving forward. I wanted to briefly talk about the touchstone analogy that Sanatana Goswami, taught us. Same thing again, a touchstone. We hear in the Chaitanya Charitamrita was some sort of stone that when you touched any metal on it, it became gold, right? So imagine you have all the money in the world, same sort of thing. Then you have access to all the sense gratification you want, kind of. And yet, Sanatana Goswami, as described, kept that touchstone in garbage. right? He just left it in the garbage bin, proving to us that, hey, the holy name, the nectar of the holy name, is really where it's at in terms of happiness. It's funny, that reminds me of what's that brahmachari's name who's based at the Bhakti Center, that African American who has glasses, who does a podcast. Anyway, I forget his name, and I think everyone. What is it? Yeah, Jai Jagannath Prabhu. I think he printed a T-shirt that says, chant Hare Krishna and be happy, or at least chant Hare Krishna. And I think that's really honest, because not to put down Prabhupada's wonderful logo, chant Hare Krishna and be happy, but most of us are not really that happy, and yet we're chanting. But the idea is like, okay, even if you're not happy, at least continue chanting. So chant Hare Krishna and be happy, or at least chant Hare Krishna. As I was saying, just coming back to this little point about Saubhari Muni and preaching sannyas, he's not preaching sannyas. This passage is not teaching renunciation of the householder ashram. Remember that, because again, his fall down is coming from a position of a actual full renunciate. And for those souls who take to the renounced order, for them to come back to a sort of a householder context is sort of a step down, right? But even then, it's not like the end of the world. I mean, you had, even in Prabhupada's movement, you had sannyasis who fell down and then who got married and who continued their Krishna consciousness just fine, But this is just an important point to remember. Now, another point I want to talk about before giving you advice is this: the story of Saubhari Muni is really relevant in the sense that it just shows you how much association, what you eat, what you see, especially, or what you hear, really can affect your life and your whole future. He was just like totally absorbed in Vishnu. He sees two fish having sex. Like, two fish? Like, they're not even mammals. You know what I mean? Like fish, for God's sakes. And that just like blew up his lust, and the next thing he knows, he's got 50 wives, and he just has to probably deal with all the headache that comes with having a husband or having a wife and kids and so on, right? So and there's a similar passage, among in the 6th canto with Ajamil, right? Remember Ajamil? He goes out, he's a nice Brahmin boy, young man, and he goes to the forest to collect some wood for his ashram or whatever, and then he sees a fallen drunkard guy, making out or maybe having sex, who knows, with a prostitute. And so it's the same sort of thing. Like Saubhari Muni sees two fish, Ajamil sees two humans, and he gets bewildered and he marries that prostitute and so on. So I thought of bringing that to the point of, one great ill in today's society is pornography. And so just, you take that thing of the fish or, the prostitute and the drunken man, and you multiply that by 2 billion, and you get the type of exposure, bewildering and degrading exposure, that, everybody has access to at, a click of their iPhone, So you can just imagine the detrimental effect of pornography on modern society. And there's all sorts of studies that talk about how this is just like the one of the greatest banes, is that the word, like ills of modern society, and how it affects just everybody, men and women, and how you can just so now coming basically to what you guys have to do, you have to be careful. You have to be careful with what you hear. Krishna talks about like the austerity of hearing only Krishna Katha. You gotta be careful what you put into your system, because you're gonna have to digest it, and it's gonna have effect on you. And so what you want, what you hear, what you see, has an effect on your consciousness, right? So on principle, you got to remember, hey, this sense gratification doesn't give me happiness. But, and that's important to remind yourself of that. I mean, why would Krishna himself remind you if it's not important? Because there's this idea that, no, let's not talk about the negatives, like, sense gratification is bad. Let's only talk about the positive, the higher taste. Of course, but hey, if Krishna himself talks about the result of sense gratification, then it behooves you to also remind yourselves of that, and that's why it's important for you to to come back to the Bhagavatam, to come back to the Bhagavad Gita and read and hear so that you're reminded about Krishna's teachings on this topic, right? The advice is always kind of the same, like if you wanna not get dragged down by sense gratification, you gotta somehow please Krishna. You gotta somehow get that higher taste. There's that very famous verse in the second chapter that you should remember. Param drishtva nivartate vishaya vinavartante niraharasya dehina raso varjam raso pyasya param drishtva nivartate. That you can restrain yourself all you want, all you can from sense objects, but you have that taste. It still remains, and therefore you keep falling back down, right? But experiencing a higher taste, then you're fixed in consciousness, right? So you got to do what you got to do in order to get that higher taste. And that higher taste translates into actually Krishna being pleased, right? When Krishna is happy, because you are a part and parcel of Krishna. So you're like a branch of the Krishna tree. And so if you pour water on your own root, then you're going to get nourishment, right? Yata taror mula nishechanena, this famous verse from the second canto of the Bhagavatam. Just like by feeding food to the stomach, all the arms and hands and stuff get energy. And just like by pouring water on the root of the tree, all the branches get nourished. So in the similar way, all right, by giving your love and by focusing your consciousness on Krishna, then you become satisfied, you become happy, right? So for some, it's it's getting really more absorbed in the Bhagavad and reading. For some, it's hearing more lectures. For some, it's going out at what's it called, Times Square, and sitting down with the Prabhus and the Vaishnavis there and just doing kirtan. For me, that's what really gives me the higher taste, is participating in kirtans. That's just like really drives away lust and drives away greed and attachment and all that, right? So you got to do what you got to do in order to keep that higher taste, because you're not going to be able to restrain yourself from sense gratification without experiencing a higher taste. And our whole bhakti process is precisely about that, about getting a higher taste, about getting such a higher taste that you give up the lower taste easily. If I give you $100 and you have $50, and I tell you give me your $50, you'll be like, yeah, sure. But if I come up to you and I don't give you any money and I say, give me your $50, you'll be like, no, that's the only money I have, right? So you gotta somehow get that higher taste, and that comes from hearing and chanting with devotees. I mean, it's an open secret. Sadhu Sangha, revolving around the Yuga Dharma and all its, all the shapes it takes, right? That's it. So if you're experiencing, struggling with your senses, then get better association, spend more time in kirtan, chant more attentive japa, right? Open secret. Now, I want to read to you quickly, before we end, a passage from the Govinda Lilamrita. This is kind of Rasika stuff, but it exemplifies this principle of how the liberated souls engage their senses in giving Krishna pleasure, and by giving Krishna pleasure, they experience pleasure. Right? So this is important for you to hear. Okay, so here's a description by Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami of the Manjaris. The Manjaris, as you know, are the assistants of the cowherd damsels of Vrindavan, the gopis. They're just younger. They all have spiritual bodies, it's believed, right? They're in Goloka Vrindavan. You've got Radharani and her, main gopis, and then they have younger maidservants who just, who are servants of the servants, who are assistants to the gopis, who, assist Radharani in giving pleasure to Krishna. So listen to this. The perfection of the Manjari's power of sight and the thirst of their eyes is to see that couple of Radha Krishna locked in embrace. The craving of their ears is to hear the holy couple's sweet murmuring conversations. And that is the fulfillment of their sense of hearing. The desire of their tongues is to relish the flavor of the condiments touched by the holy couple's lips. And in that way, their sense of taste attains perfection. Similarly, the sweet fragrance that arises at the holy couple's union is the object craved for by their nostrils. and its experience is the fulfillment of their sense of smell. The tactile sense finds plenitude in massaging the holy couple's feet and bodies, and this is the only object of their sense of touch. And in 2 verses later, just 2 lines, Kaviraj Goswami continues, and this is far out. Check this out. If Krishna should touch Srimati Radharani, then lo and behold, all her manjaris start trembling. They sweat and their bodily hair stand on end, and tears well in their eyes. And if Krishna should carefully sip the spirituous liquor of Radha's lips, it is they who become intoxicated. This is truly wonderful. So again, the idea, like in the spiritual world, liberated souls get pleasure by giving pleasure to Krishna. Right? That's the idea. They give pleasure by giving pleasure to Krishna. So now, that's in the spiritual world. But Narottam Das Thakur has reminded you, Golokera Premadana Harinam Sankirtan. That the treasure of Goloka Vrindavan, the treasure of the kingdom of God, the treasure of the intimate, exchanges of love between God and the eternal associates of God has descended into this material world as Harinam Sankirtan. Right? As the chanting of the holy name, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram, Hare Hare. So if you want to, taste that nectar, you got to engage in Harinam Sankirtan. That's the bottom line, really, right? So to conclude, maybe we could just ask for a couple of questions before concluding. What do you think?
It was really beautiful. It was a very clear presentation, like your video.
Thank you.
So nice. And also you drove 2 main points that I really loved. One is about like how sense gratification does not give satisfaction, and also like how to experience real satisfaction through giving satisfaction to Krishna. So it was like very systematically presented on these 2 points. So I really appreciate the point that you drove home. So devotees, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions or appreciations. One thing I can add is like, yes, Ananda Vihari, do you want to ask something?
Yes, Hare Krishna.
Haribol, we can't hear you so well.
So good. See you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. Beautiful class. Thank you so much. My question is, you mentioned how material, how money doesn't.
We can't hear you again. We can't hear you. I can't hear you, Ananda Bihari Prabhu. Can't hear you. Now he's frozen.
I think his internet is weak.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question on the chat box you can take, but then I'll just ask him.
Okay. So I just click on the chat box.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is from Kartik. Hare Krishna, thank you for the one class. Thank you. Why is our progress on the spiritual path so fragile, and how do we make progress more resilient? Wait, Ananda, maybe we can read this one first, or you tell us, Prabhuji.
No, you can take the question on the chat.
Okay.
Just tell him to. Yeah.
So yeah, why is our progress on the spiritual path so fragile? Well, look, my sort of speculated answer, based on Shastra, is that we've been chasing sense gratification for a lot of lives, for a long, like millions and billions of lifetimes. So we've got like super deep rooted tendencies to just run after sense gratification. That's what you do in one lifetime, that's what you do in the next one, that's what you do in 5 billion lifetimes. And so all of a sudden now we're just like, wait a second, we're going the wrong way, and it's just like you imagine you're in 5th gear, on a German highway where there's no speed limit, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I got to get in reverse, imagine you press the clutch and you force the clutch into reverse, the kind of like upheaval it does to the system, to the engine. So similarly, we're changing course all of a sudden, and so therefore we're fragile, and therefore this is new for us, and therefore it's difficult. And even if Saubhari Muni's spiritual progress was so fragile, what hope is there for lesser mortals? Well, the hope is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mercy. Patita Pavana. The mercy is Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. I've made it really easy. Remember, like there's this anecdote where Prabhupada was laughing at a kirtan. It was in London. They still have a little asana on the altar in the Soho temple, a small little, like a Vyasasana, a small one on the altar with nothing on it. Why? It's for Narada Muni or Vyasadeva, I forgot. Like Prabhupada was laughing, and they asked him afterwards, like, why were you laughing, Prabhupada? He said, didn't you see it? It was Narada Muni. There was, I don't know if about Vyasadeva, but Narada Muni was here, and we were laughing at you all, and we were laughing at just how you are all such Kali Yuga devotees. So, like, if we actually are honest or a little realistic, it's like we're really, really fallen. And so, yeah, the mercy is, the hope is Lord Chaitanya. The hope is Lord Chaitanya, who's the savior of the fallen souls. We're cartoonish, ridiculous Kali Yugites, just like really, really low class, with all our material qualifications, whatever. We're all really, really just ridiculously fallen, right? And so yeah, we have the hope of we can embrace Lord Chaitanya's mercy as our hope. Okay, please elaborate more on how money doesn't bring happiness. I'm not convinced. I was told the same point, but I caught myself thinking it didn't work. It didn't work for him, but it may work for me. Yeah, that's what we all think, isn't it? Like, it didn't work for me, but look, he's enjoying. And so, yeah. I mean, look, first of all, according to our philosophy, we can't change what we're going to get anyway, very much at all, right? From Brahma Samhita says that we have an allotted amount of money, and we're going to get that no matter what, right? So that should be a source of comfort in a way. That look, we may not become millionaires, but whatever. I mean, whatever our destiny is, we're going to get that. That's our karma. Now, as far as, come on, that money doesn't give satisfaction. Everyone's got that experience. But of course we shouldn't be irresponsible and not try to work, especially if we're living in the world and we have to pay rent in New York City and we have to, feed our children and give them education and so on. So we do our best to make money, but, there really isn't something more deeply satisfying than just like, okay, I've stopped working, I've stopped trying to make money, and now I'm just going to absorb myself in hearing the Bhagavatam or hang out with devotees and read together or do a kirtan or Rath Yatra, I mean, come on, walking down the parade of Rath Yatra, which is going to be in a couple of weeks, right? That's even for fallen souls like us, is a lot more satisfying than chasing after money, right? And if you're not satisfied, then I don't know, I guess you just have to wait till you get a lot of money, if you do, and then you'll see, like, okay, I'm not that happy actually. Anybody else?
Hare Krishna. Yeah, can I just follow up on that answer?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, intellectually, we all know that money doesn't buy happiness. You can't become happy by getting, getting that beautiful body or by getting any of the opulences. Intellectually, we do know that, but when we see that, gorgeous person, still in the heart, there's, well, if I look like that, or if I won the lotto, there's what you understand in your head, and then there's what you feel in your heart. And we're confronted, I think, with that every time we do see somebody else with that opulence, even though we know, to some extent, that those things don't actually bring, permanent satisfaction to the heart. So I think the question is more about like how to actually, really have that level of realization where so that you're really not affected by that question anymore about like, yes, I know it doesn't bring happiness, but I don't feel like it.
Good point. Anyone else? Or should we close? Going once?
Actually, it wasn't just it wasn't just a comment for Boo. It was more like, how do we get that increased depth of realization that brings our knowledge from the head to the heart?
Well, I think that's a yeah, okay. I think that's a question of you finished the question. Yeah, I don't mean to say like, are you done yet? I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think it's, Divya Gyan Hriday Prakashito. We sing the Narottam Das Thakur song, the Guru Puja song, as we call it. Divya Gyan Hriday Prakashito. The Divya Gyan, there's a thing about, realized knowledge, and that's revealed in the heart. And that's revealed in the heart by the mercy of the Guru, of the Gurus, of the Vaishnavas, of Krishna. So that realization is it's not automatic, it's not mechanical. But yeah, we want realized knowledge, and that realized knowledge again comes from the practice of Krishna. It's revelation. Ye yatamam prapadyante tam sataiva bhajamyaham. As one takes shelter of me, as one surrenders unto me, I reward him accordingly. So, practically speaking, we just have to be patient, as Rupa Goswami tells us. We have to just be patient and continue day after day practicing our Krishna consciousness, staying in good association, trying our best to avoid sense gratification, trying our best to absorb our mind in Krishna's thoughts, trying our best to wake up early and to chant good rounds and so on. The whole process, and with and trying to give Krishna to others in some form or other. Excuse me. And we have to have faith that gradually that realization will dawn in us. Gradually it will, and it continues, and we already have some, and it will just continue if you continue pleasing the Vaishnavas and pleasing Krishna.
Okay, so therefore, I guess maybe in reciprocation for all of our endeavors, the sadhana that we do and the things that you mentioned, in reciprocation for that, we receive by mercy that realization in the heart. It's not that we can, get that realization in the heart on our own strength just by, intellectually knowing it. That has to be given to us, it seems like what you're saying.
I agree. I agree with what I say.
Okay. Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Well, I think we summed it up pretty well, That's what I wanted to close with. Like, we have to, we should be happy to be together in this Krishna consciousness movement. And we should continue, cooperating, sticking close to each other, doing Harinam Sankirtan together. And in this way we can just all come, go back home, back to Godhead, avoiding, the suffering that comes under the disguise of Maya. And continue experiencing a little bit or a lot of reciprocation with Krishna, and be happy about that. Jai, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna, Jai Prabhupada, Jai all the Vaishnavas. Thank you. See you at Rath Yatra, Krishna willing. Hare Krishna.